Okay.
There you go.
Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Carlo Jimenez. I'm here with my co-host.
I'm George Shahada.
And today we are privileged to interview our professor, Mr. Antonio. I'm not sure if you want to give a little rundown on yourself, a little information on
Well,
your
very
background.
shortly.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Absolutely.
And I'm honored to be your first guest on your first podcast, hopefully first of many.
Yes.
My background is in strength and conditioning for the last 15 years or so. I did have to go to school and get a PhD to be able to continue my career, but I consider myself much more of a practitioner than a researcher. So if there's anything I can share with you guys about the practice of strength and conditioning, that's what I'm hopefully decent about, this and that. But we can talk about science if you want to. So whatever question you have, just throw it my way, and we work through that together.
Yes.
Let me know that you guys look very professional for your first podcast. It's impressive.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
It's really impressive.
We're really setting the bar high. You from Italy and you
Yes.
immigrated here.
Correct.
So did you immigrate here before starting strength and conditioning?
No. I moved to the States to work in strength and conditioning.
Okay.
So in Europe, when I was going through school, I played professional football, American football.
Wow.
So that's how I got exposed to the world of strength and conditioning. And I got to work professionally across Europe. And that's where I learned about strength and conditioning and what strength and conditioning is. But our strength and conditioning was very basic. Our coach walked in the locker room, gave us a book called Bigger, Faster, Stronger, and told us just, this is the book, read it, train that way, you're done. That was the strength and conditioning we had. And I knew that could have been done better. So that's why I went to school, learn about strength and conditioning, start training myself through my career. At my best, I was 320 pounds, squatting well over 700 pounds, deadlifting over 800 pounds. Oh, and I did that programming for myself, so I lived through it.
The results, yes.
And I wanted to do that as a job, but they don't pay for a strength and conditioning coach for American football in Europe. So I did some work with rugby. I did some work with the women national team, which I loved because rugby is a sport where like strength training matters a lot. So I could really see the benefit of the work we were doing. Nevertheless, I still want an experience in American football because I felt like that and track and field were the two sports that I needed. I knew better than any other sport because I played them. So I started applying to jobs in the state. And I'm not lying to you. I still have the same Gmail account. I sent 114 emails looking for a job. I got one answer from Boston. And that's how I started my career in strength and conditioning. I just went there, unpaid, just room and board. It's funny because it's a small college in Boston. And my English was, not that my English is good now, but it was very bad back then. And the head coach called me on a Tuesday. We start training on Thursday, try to be here. So I flew here. I flew to Boston. And they showed me what the room was that I was going to stay. And there was a room with no bed, no closet. I didn't know where to get a bed. I didn't know where to get a mattress. So I slept on the ground for like a month and a half just to be able to coach. And that's how I started getting traction in the field and continue staying with it. And I coached in Canada. I came back to the States, and one thing led into the other. And then I decided that after the Olympics in 2016, I wanted to raise the bar higher and get more educated. So that's why I chose the academic path for a little bit. And now I'm back into more coaching and teaching.
Yes, because he is our professor.
I'm your instructor. Like, I'm not good enough to be a professor. Yeah, I'm your instructor.
You're too humble.
Coming from Italy, what did you feel that you could offer in terms of training athletes here in the United States?
Sounds like you listened to one of my podcasts before. That's a good question.
Yeah.
So I do a lot of comparing between, I don't want to say the Italian style because it's more like European approach to strength and conditioning. Maybe outside the UK. The UK do things a little bit differently. Italy is very much, well, first of all, Italy and Europe in general, they're about 10 to 15 years behind when it comes to the practice, not the science, just the practice of strength and conditioning. Because, well, for many, many, many reasons, one of them being this lack of endorsement from professional teams for strength and conditioning coaches. Therefore, there's not a real job as a strength and conditioning coach. It's like a side job that people do. Mm-hmm. So everything develops much slower. And we're changing that. As a matter of fact, in about 2 weeks from now, I'll be in Europe, in Germany, and we're meeting with a bunch of NSA affiliates in Europe to turn the job of a strength and conditioning coach into a legitimate profession. So things are changing, but they're changing now, and they're changing slowly. So all that thing to say that what I can offer, what I learned from Italy is a greater, deeper appreciation for true sciences. Like, we need to learn physiology. We can't coach unless we know physiology. We need to learn biomechanics. We don't look at whatever is cool and trendy at the moment. We just always go back to science. Whereas, that's also because our market is smaller. So we have less influencers, we have less influences in general in the field. Whereas here in the States, because the market is so much bigger and technology is so much more advanced, and there's so many more like either coaches or practitioners or people in the private field, the shared knowledge constantly, I feel like it's way easier to get sidetracked and get lost in the woods of like what's trendy, what's fancy, what's cool, but we never remember to look back and look at science. Because one thing I say, and like, you know, the NSCA is, our mission is bridging the gap between theory and practice. And that's the essence of evidence-based practice. But I always tell people like you, we don't do evidence-based practice. We try to do evidence-based practice. We're never going to be perfect. We're never going to be scientifically sounded. We're just going to try to do our best to get there. And that comes from some solid foundation of like knowing your physiology, knowing your anatomy, know your biomechanics, learn the sport, learn bioenergetics. Once you learn that, coaching becomes, in one sense, easier, more straightforward, but on the opposite end, a little bit more complex because you have less room to play around. Like if you look at some of the core programs, they have like 10, 12, 20 different exercises. True coaching can happen with a handful of exercises, but you need to do them very well because you know the physiology behind them and you know how to adjust them to get the outcome that you want from any athletes at any point in time, no matter fatigue level, in-season, off-season, sport they're playing.
How did you adapt the education there into here, into your methods?
That's another great question.
Because you mentioned the science difference is mostly the different trend that they have here in the United States. So 10 to 15 years behind in Europe. When you come here, is that a lot of reading?
It was a cultural shock. Like at the beginning, I'm not joking. At the beginning, first of all, I barely knew the language. I didn't learn English in school. I learned English translating the NSCA textbook to take the exam for the CSCS.
Right.
And then I flew to the States to get my CSCS first. When I got my first job, I literally thought everyone could be an engineer at NASA for how smart they were. Like I wasn't exposed to, I'd never been exposed to that prior to coming to the States. Like I thought, I got my athletes to squat, do some plyometrics, I'm pretty cool. Then I got to the States and they were doing all these cool things like velocity-based training. They were doing Olympic lifts. They have technology in a way that to me was completely foreign. So at the beginning was a lot of catching up and a lot of sleepless nights, try to figure out a way to navigate the field. But then once you get, it's all about like putting things in perspective. Like you need to be comfortable being uncomfortable doing the hard work at the beginning. But once you get in this ring of things that you start like understanding where everyone is coming from, you probably can take the best of what they're doing, leave what you don't agree with, make up your own mind and develop your own coaching philosophies, methods, mentality.
Yeah, that's really reassuring. I think coming from the position we're all in right now, considering, we're young adults, we're trying to figure out our position and where we fit in within the fitness industry. And I think, you definitely have a great story to prove that you can really make it happen if you want to. So it's inspiring to hear that you were passionate enough to pursue it, cross borders. You came all the way over here and you had a dream and you made it happen. So that makes me feel a little bit better about some uncertainties that I'm like experiencing, within the field and stuff like that. But not to cut George off or anything like that, but you mentioned theory earlier and how, that's emphasized. So that kind of is a good segue into our first article.
Look at you. So professional.
I know I was going to jump in. I didn't want to cut George off, but the first article that I'm going to introduce to our viewers is titled Velocity-Based Training from Theory to Application. It was released by the Strength and Conditioning Journal. And to just give a little synopsis, essentially, it delves into the transformative power of velocity-based training for coaches and athletes. It states that VBT enables coaches to assess an athlete's neuromuscular status by tracking changes in velocity during exercise. By interpreting these velocity-based data points, coaches can identify fatigue, track improvements, and optimize training loads. Additionally, velocity loss thresholds allow for personalized training intensity, which minimize the risk of overtraining and injury. It also provides real-time feedback and dynamic adjustments. VBT can enhance training effectiveness and long-term athletic development, according to the study that we found. And overall, VBT, it seems as if it's revolutionizing coaching strategies and providing valuable insights for maximizing athlete performance. So that's a little brief insight to our first article that we found. And again, since you mentioned theory, I thought that that'd be a good segue into your, just what your opinion on that. I don't know if George has anything to offer before you.
I know your area of expertise is VBT. Before we dive into VBT, though, I wanted to get the traditional methods down for the viewers. Just hypertrophy and strength training. What are the key differences between hypertrophy-focused training and strength-focused training?
What if I answer your questions together and we start from the basic and we advance to VBT? What about that?
That would be revolutionary.
Because I think you can only do that if you really want to understand the advantage of velocity-based training.
Right.
So, and if you're okay with that, I'll take a step back, focus on strength first, and then we talk about hypertrophy later. I don't want to dismiss that. I just want to keep everyone on track. So, what we normally do when it comes to strength training is and I'm not going to be able to speak as nicely and scientific like you did. I'm not the smartest person in the room, so I'm going to catch up with whatever I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
To bring the message down to like a level that everyone can understand.
A bit more digestible.
So the way we normally do strength training is also referred to as sometimes percentage-based training, which means that we know strength has to do with the neuromuscular system. And when it comes to anything that involves strength and power or speed and power always go hand in hand. Intensity drives adaptation. It's a matter of like how much power you can generate when you lift. And that amount of power, if it's good enough and high enough, is going to drive positive adaptation. It's going to make you more powerful. So when we prescribe intensity, usually we use a percentage of 1 rep max. And based on that percentage of 1 rep max, that's kind of like our main ingredient. And then we shape everything else based on that, like number of sets, number of reps, right, depending on the exercise we choose, rest period. And we can do that very, very well. That's as close as we can get to evidence-based practice, because we know that if you want to get someone stronger, training at 60% is not going to do it. You need to be at 80% or above. If you're 80% or above, looking at normative data, you know that you can only do, 5-6 reps at most. You can do more than that. Right. If you're pushing very heavy, you can only do 3 to 4 sets. So that's how we learn how to create our programs. That's great. There's a problem with that. Like everything else in science is what usually works for the average person, which means that if I take 3 people in this room and I give the same identical evidence-based program, 3 sets of 3, 80% on 1 rep max with 5 minutes rest to all of you, I know that on paper that program is going to make you stronger, but I have no way to know if this is the best program for you at that particular moment in time. And I don't know that because I don't know that external load that I'm creating, so sets, reps, and load, what that corresponds in terms to internal load for you, so the stress your body is exposed to, and whether or not the stress is a positive one that is going to drive positive adaptation, or is a negative one that is going to create either a plateau or even more so an injury. That's what we want to stay away from. So VBT fills in that gap because now I have access to an objective measurement, which is velocity, and that velocity is going to be the same for everyone in this room in a set number of exercises. And based on that velocity, I know precisely if my load is accurate for you to develop strength. If you're moving between 0.5 meter per second or 0.7 meter per second, no matter of the load, you're training for strength in a basic compound lift. If you're slower than that, you're also getting stronger, but I know you're not going to get any more powerful. You're just going to get stronger. Your 1 rep max is going to improve, but your power is not going to change. On the opposite end, if you're moving faster, I know you're getting more explosive. You might be jumping higher, but your strength is not increase. It's not going to increase. So it keeps you in that ballpark where like we optimize adaptation. On top of that, now I can tell you, okay, 3 sets of 3 of back squat at 80%. I don't know how fatigued those sets are going to get you. So I don't know if like set 1 is going to be as good as set 2 is going to be as good as set 3. I might get you very, very powerful and explosive set 1 and 2. Then maybe you're too fatigued, you start slowing down too much, you're not getting any positive adaptation anymore. With VBT, you mentioned that by looking at the decay in velocity, which is known as velocity loss, I can see if you're getting too fatigued and I can adjust the load accordingly. Even more so, and I'm not going to complicate things too much. I can tell you today, do 3 sets of 3 at 80% of water max. You come in fresh, you're rested, you ate well, you slept well, you crash that workout, you feel great. But then you come back next time, I give you the same identical program, but now you haven't rested well, you're fatigued, you're tired. The discrepancy, and follow me on this one, the discrepancy between external load, so the weight on the bar, and internal load can be up to 20% when you're fatigued, which means that you have on the bar, you have 80% of water max. You're going to feel it like 100% of water max. Right. If I ask you to do 3 sets of 3, it's going to crush you. You might be able to push through it, but I'm exposing you deliberately to a higher risk of injury because I'm asking you to do something that is more than you can tolerate.
Because you're at a deficit.
You're at a deficit. You're fatigued. But by looking at velocity, I will know whether or not you're fatigued. I don't have to guess it. So if your velocity starts to decline, I can adjust the load to keep you in the optimal velocity range that you need to improve adaptation. And what that happens is that it might sound like, oh yeah, that's cool, but I can just get more rest and I'll be fine without VBT. True. But sometimes you're in a condition where you need a certain frequency of training to get better. You need to be exposed to that load to get better. And you only gain that quality and consistency if you use velocity-based training. If you don't, it's more of a guesswork. And sooner or later, that's going to catch up and you either going to hit a plateau and don't know what to do about it, or you're going to get people hurt. So VBT is a great way to not only be more effective, but also be more careful in the way we program. When it comes to hypertrophy, I haven't forgot about that question. They're linked. Why? Because when we look at a strength or power, we're looking at neuromuscular efficiency, how well your brain works together with your muscles. For that to happen, you always have to be in a condition of, you have to be fresh. You have to be rested. If you're moving at heavy weight, slower than what your maximum capacity is, you're not getting any stronger, any more powerful. You're just grinding through reps. You need to be able to express a decent amount of velocity to have adaptation, which means you need to be rested. When you do hypertrophy training, none of that matters. When you do hypertrophy training, it's not about neuromuscular efficiency. It's about metabolic damage. You want to fatigue your muscles as much as you possibly can because that's going to drive adaptation. That's going to make your muscle grow. So velocity doesn't matter at all. That's why you train to failure. That's why you do slow eccentrics. That's why you do all that type of interventions that you wouldn't do for strength training. So that's the biggest difference, and it's an important one. And that's the one that brings us to realize that probably we don't need velocity-based training when we do hypertrophy. We can do pretty much anything we want. As long as we put a program, we're going to grow muscles. As long as we train well, eat well, get the right amount of calories, get the right amount of proteins, we're going to grow. But that's not the same thing for strength, and even more so for power. It's very easy to get people stronger. It's way more difficult to get people stronger and more powerful. And that's where VBT comes into play. Because now you have a metric that tells you at that load, for that amount of reps, at that velocity, your water max is going to improve, but your power is going to improve as well. I hope I gave you an answer that is worth my time here. For you to have me here, not me to be here, for you to listen to me. Because I'm delighted to be here. I just don't want to annoy you.
That was very insightful. Thank you for being so just detailed. You definitely.
So correct me if I'm wrong. Velocity allows you to be more consistent even though the weight is lighter.
Correct.
Is that something you would prescribe more for like a younger athlete or like a more professional athlete?
Good question.
Like what's the demographic?
So let me just clarify one thing. Allows you to stay on target with your goal when you're fatigued, eventually by lowering the weights. The goal is not to lower the weights. Velocity-based training is never an excuse to use less weight. Is a way to make sure that you use adequate load every time in every condition, when you're fatigued or not. Because there's a limit at which, like, okay, let's say that you were moving a certain way, let's say a 0.8 meter per second. If you're moving it at 0.4, you're probably excessively fatigued. You shouldn't even be training. So there's a little bit of there's a boundaries where you lower the weight. You can't say, oh, I'm doing VBT, let me do 20% of water max. It's not going to work. You still need to stay within a certain target zone. Velocity-based training allows you to understand when and how to go lighter when you need to. In that respect, it could be used for younger athletes as well. In theory, it could be used for younger athletes as well. The only problem I have is that you're relying on a device that measures velocity. And that velocity needs to be a reliable metric, which needs to be standardized. It needs to be consistent and reliable. For that to happen, your lifting technique needs to be extremely sound and consistent. And that's usually not the case for younger athletes. Like your range of motion needs to be on point, your technique needs to be on point. Let's say a squat, your depth needs to be on point. And most importantly, your intent to lift with velocity needs to be on point. So if you're asking me about chronological age, in theory can be used for younger athletes too, or younger people in general too, but has more to do with training age more than chronological age. If you're 16, but you've been lifting since you were 10 or 8 or 12, then you probably can use velocity-based training. If you're 16 and you're just starting to lift, probably velocity-based training is not the best solution for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's more about training age more than chronological age.
The reason I mention younger athletes is because I'm always curious, how much does strength really matter when it comes to performance, like in a skill-based sport? Because you can have someone who benches 500 pounds, but when they go to swing a baseball bat, they might not hit as hard as someone who benches half as much. So how do you balance strength? Do you favor strength then velocity, or velocity then strength?
Good question. You never favor one or the other. You always do both. However, and I'll repeat myself if needed. This is quite a difficult topic to grasp unless you have a little bit of experience testing athletes. So for every sport, men and women, different level of like professional level, high school level, collegiate level, we know that there seems to be a minimum level of strength that you need to have in order to perform. Like every sport is different, every situation is different. The majority is like you need to be able to back squat 2 times your body weight for an adult. That's pretty common, or 1.5 times if you're a female. But that differs from sport to sport, which means that if we take a bunch of athletes competing in the same sport, those who perform better in the sport seems to have similar level of strength. So that's kind of like a minimum you want to get to. It's kind of like you have to check the box, make sure that you have it. But that doesn't mean that once you get to the level of strength, you're going to stop training for strength. You should, there's not such a thing as too much strength. You want to develop as much strength as possible, as long as that development is not hindering you from developing other qualities you need for that sport. Like you can't just say, oh, I'm going to train like a power lifter for my entire life because that's all I need. If that's preventing you from working on speed, working on power, working on technique, then you're deviating from the path. But if you can continue developing strength past that minimum level, and at the same time, you're keeping a good body weight, you're being explosive, you're being fast, well, so be it. Keep getting strength. Keep getting stronger. There's no limit to it. Also because if you look at a lot of, and I'm not going to get into that field because it's not my expertise, but if you look at a lot of meta-analysis on the risk of injury, one of the strongest predictor is strength levels. If you're stronger, you're less likely to get hurt. So there's not such a thing as too much strength. The problem is that sometimes people get too concerned about getting stronger and they lose sight of other things that equally matter when it comes to developing an athlete. Like you can't just squat heavy all the time. You need to do some heavy squats, some fast squats, some plyometrics. You need to do some Olympic lifts. You need to do some technical work in your own sport. If that emphasis of strength takes over everything else, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, because I know there's like a notion out there, especially I think now in the NBA, but there's like a notion out there that too much strength impedes, your speed and mobility. So, I always wonder, I know you can take a quick athlete and make them strong. Can you take a strong athlete and make them quick? Does it work the other way around?
Yeah, you totally could. So it's a problem of quality over quantity. So you can potentially train for strength and at the same time get faster. So get stronger as you get faster. The problem is that strength training, the quality of that strength training needs to be closely monitored. That's something that you can do with VBT. Because the downside of strength training, and that's what a lot of people are not aware of, if you train for strength And that brings you to a point where you start doing either too much volume or you start getting too slow because you're lifting too heavy. That is the type of strength that is going to make you slower down the line. So that's the downside of doing too much of low quality strength training work. But if you can keep up with the demand and do strength training, always prioritizing velocity, then you can turn someone that is very, very strong into someone that is also very, very fast.
Yeah.
But it's the quality that matters.
That reminds me of like how the best performers at the NFL Combine, they're not always the best players on the field.
Correct.
So
correct. Strength is a measurement of capacity. It shows you what you're capable of doing. Doesn't mean that you can do that. Like in theory, if you squat 400 pounds, you should be able to run pretty fast. In theory, because that's a measurement of capacity. For you to be able to bridge that gap and do it, you need to incorporate in your training elements that are going to, it's a word that I don't like a lot, but transform or translate that strength into speed and power. You're not transforming anything. They're two sides of the same metal. Strength and velocity always get any end. But for the way we traditionally approach periodization, we do hypertrophy, then we do strength, then we do power. Please don't do that. Don't do linear periodization. Please stop it. Just do undulated periodization.
Well, you just segued me into
okay,
the
there
next
you go.
one. So the next article that I found was the role of velocity-based training in the strength periodization for modern athletes.
Yes.
So this was released by the Department of Human Movement and Sports Sciences of the University of Rome.
Yep.
And this review explores the role of velocity-based training in optimizing resistance training for elite athletes. It emphasizes the importance of monitoring movement velocity alongside traditional training variables. The article states that VBT offers advantages such as real-time feedback on training readiness and fatigue accumulation, potentially surpassing traditional intensity prescription methods. Studies on competitive athletes show promising results in terms of improved strength, power, and sport-specific performance. The review advocates for integrating VBT into strength and training programs for elite athletes, but acknowledges the need for further research to refine its implementation.
Okay. Can I take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You definitely brought it up.
Let me clear the air a little bit. Nothing wrong with linear periodization.
Okay.
If you're working in general population, great. If you're working in rehab, where like you're taking an athlete that either underwent an injury or like had to take some time off from training, which usually comes with like atrophy and muscle waste and all that good stuff, then you need to do hypertrophy, that builds some strength, and then eventually move into more explosive stuff. Perfect. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is when you're looking at pure performance. Now you're after performance. And I'm going to say something that, first of all, I'm not going to regret saying, but it's going to complicate things a lot. If you do velocity-based training the way it's intended to do, you do not need periodization anymore. There's no need for periodization anymore. You can constantly train and get stronger and faster and more powerful all year round and be in peak condition all year round. No matter of like maybe like a 4 or 5 days deload if you're fatigued, that's it. But there's no more need for mesocycle, microcycles. You just have to rotate through a system where like you have a load and a velocity. When you can move the same load at a higher velocity, you increase the load. And it keeps you on target for what you need to do. There's absolutely no more need for periodization at all. Of course, there should be a middle ground because periodization is about not just weightlifting and weight training. If you're working with an athlete, you have to keep in consideration like their competition schedule, their practice schedule. There's a lot of stuff that is not just weight room. So you want to have some structure. But in theory, just by looking at the load on the bar and the velocity that you know the athlete is capable of doing, and the velocity they do at every given point during the week based on fatigue levels, you can do what is known as auto-regulation, which is a very crazy thing that people like spin things on their back just because they're lazy. Auto-regulation doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want in the weight room as long as you get the right velocity. Far from it. It's not like, I decide that today I want to go 0.8 because I don't feel like going 0.5 because it's too heavy. Far from it. Auto-regulation means that like when you can't do what you're supposed to do, you know what's the best second option. That's auto-regulation. It's not freedom to do whatever you want and hoping that you're going to get better. Right. You need to stay on a program. You need to stay on task. It just gives you the flexibility that if you get to the weight room and you're supposed to do, I don't know, 70% at 0.5 meter per second, and that 70% is not even moving at 0.4 meter per second, you say, okay, I'm clearly fatigued. This is not working. What can I do to stay on track with my program that is not going to deviate too much so I can get the consistency in training? That's what auto-regulation means. If you have the system in place, technically, you don't need any more periodization. Or if not, maybe just a small tweak when you like, in track cycling, we do a lot of like blocks where we focus on torque, so force, and blocks where we focus on RPM or cadence or velocity. That comes with the nature of the sport. So you can have that level of like accuracy in the way you program for your sport, but that's about it. It's a minor tweak. It's like one time you go, I don't know, like 70%, 0.5 meter per second for a few weeks, and then you go to like 60% and like 0.8 meter per second for another few weeks. It's a minor tweak, but it's not like rebuilding a whole mesocycle worth of training. It's tiny, tiny things. Or like you do more eccentric based exercises off season to prevent injury and develop like muscle stiffness and whatnot, because you need that, but those are also very fatiguing. You get rid of them during the season because you want to mitigate the effect of fatigues. At that point, it becomes common sense. It's not a matter of like knowing the ins and outs of like periodization. It's just common sense.
You have experience with cycling and track and field. How do you navigate programming for sports you're not as familiar with? Is VBT universal in that sense?
VBT itself is universal. Just when you think about VBT, the best analogy I can give you is, I don't know if you're into like marketing or business or anything like that, but I'll tell you this little story. When I was going to college, I was working for a store in Italy. It's called Decathlon, which is the equivalent of like Dick's Sporting Goods here in the States. I was selling like treadmills and supplements at the fitness area. And my boss back, I couldn't care less about that job. It was just to make money and pay tuitions. But my boss back then was huge into marketing. And he said, every morning you need to look at the report from the day before and you need to focus on your, I think he called them your 20/80s. So 20% of your items, they give you 80% of your money income, like the money that you're making. Right. And you need to make sure that you have those 20% of items always available at the store, because that's going to drive the money you make that day.
Profit, yeah.
So velocity-based training is at 20/80. Is at 20% of your training that is going to give you 80% of the return of investment. But you still have another 80% to fill in with like exercise and training modalities and whatnot. So VBT is that 20% no matter what, no matter the sport. It's about strength and power. You're going to use it the same way for any athlete you work with. Is the remaining 80% that is going to be different depending on the sport you're working with. And you can totally work with sports that you don't know. Like I was a complete beginner when I started working with track cycling. Like I was training myself at the velodrome because I enjoyed it, but I had no background expertise in the sports of track cycling. But if you have, and we go back to the same point we discussed before, if you understand physics, biomechanics, chemistry, biology, and bioenergetics, you can understand all sports on the face of the earth. You don't need to have played them to understand them. But you need to have a solid foundation of biomechanics and bioenergetics. And a little bit like if you should take the CSCS and pass it and become strength and conditioning coaches. But if you look at what the NSA calls the needs analysis, there are 3 pillars of any needs analysis: biomechanics, bioenergetic, injury prevention, or injury risk. All those informations are objective. All you need to know is your science. Once you know length of an effort, intensity level, and energy systems, you can understand the sport. You need to have some experience in the coaching environment so that you can translate that science into an actual program. That's a difficult thing to do. But once you have that in place, no matter if you learn that in soccer, in weightlifting, doesn't matter. As long as you've learned that skill, you can coach any sport. You need to be willing to put in the hours and learn the behind the scenes of the work. Like, okay, what type of athletes I'm dealing with? What are the key performance indicators? Like, is it about endurance? Is it about strength? Like, you need to like dig deep and really understand the sport. And then you have to be willing to sit along some of the athletes and also learn the way they used to train, tradition in the sport. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, you mentioned track and field. A big thing for like a thrower is having a big bench. They want to have a big number on the bench. if we look at science, that's completely pointless. There's no correlation between or it's a very little correlation between your bench press and the distance you're throwing. There's a strong correlation between like how much you clean and the distance you throw, but not about you how much you bench and the distance you throw. But culturally in the sport, bench pressing is a massive part of what they are and what they do. So if you take that away, athletes are not going to buy in your program. Everything else is going to fall apart. But not because of what you're doing right, it's because of what you pull out of their system that is not going to get them equally motivated in training and complying to the type of program you're doing. So you need to understand objectively the sport, but then you also have to develop enough soft skills to be able to relate to the athletes, understand what they're expecting from a training program, and kind of like meet halfway. You know what I mean?
Okay.
You're not coming to compromise. You're not compromising anything. Science is science. You can't change it. You're just meeting halfway so you can do what you know they need. They feel like they've been heard. They buy into your program, and then eventually you develop that relationship that will eventually bring you down the line to do exactly what you want to do. But you have to have that softness at the beginning to be.
You're just making it applicable for what they're doing. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. I've heard you mention like bench and squat. Those typically a lot of powerlifting movements, and powerlifting is simple. You train with the bar to compete with the bar. How is it different from training using strength and conditioning for a sport?
It's very difficult, very different. Because I know you guys are very, very young, so you probably never heard of it. But like maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this big trend, I want to call it. It was based on a series of books, great books, called Transfer of Training by Anatoly Bondarchuk, one of the most successful coaches in the history of sport. What that book is about is like, okay, now we're working with athletes that are not barbell athletes. So no weightlifters and no power lifters. We're working with other athletes. Mostly, he was a throwing coach, so mostly throwers, but the same principle apply to all sports. Your expertise and your skill as a strength and conditioning coach is to be able to say, okay, like I can potentially do all sorts of lifts in the weight room and exercises. How do I choose which one are the most important? Well, you choose that, in theory, looking at the correlation between improvement in that specific lift and improvement in performance in competition. In track and field, it's very easy. Like, is your squat going up? Is your speed going up? Well, then the squat is important. Is your deadlift going up, but your speed is not changing? Then probably deadlift is not that important. It's as simple as that. If you're looking at like a jumper, what does that matter if you bench more or not? If your bench press is going up, your jumping performance is not changing, there's no correlation. There's no transfer of training. So you need to be able to pick those lifts that happen to be the best lift for the sport. And what's funny about that is that if you really do that, if you really, really take your time to do that, you realize that it's an handful of lifts and they work for all athletes. It's always a variation of a squat, some type of jumping, maybe some throwing, maybe some Olympic lift. That's all you need to really coach pretty much any sport. What you're really dealing with is not what exercises you need, because you probably know that, is what exercise your athletes are capable of doing. And that's where you need to accommodate a lot and break down, okay, they can't do a squat, maybe they can do a trap bar squat or a trap bar deadlift. They don't want to do that because they don't like it, and then you come to compromise and then you have to adjust it. But you're adjusting not because the sport requires adjustment. It's because your athletes cannot stick with the program they should be doing in the first place, or they maybe don't want to. So there's a lot of like soft skills in communicating that to the athlete.
Yeah, there are outside factors that play a role.
Yes. I hope I answered your question. I hope I did.
Yeah.
All right. Well, although we would love to continue picking your brain on all of this.
We can do a second episode.
Right.
We
We're
On a
definitely
different day.
we're not limited to, we might just have to start a season.
Maybe one day we'll be on Netflix. What do you know?
Right. Maybe
What do you know?
Maybe we'll get a contract.
At what point does exceptional strength stop translating to performance on the field?
Whoa, that's a great question.
Can you have an athlete who, I know you said like squat and running speed. can you have an athlete who squats a lot but doesn't run as fast?
Totally.
How do you fix that? What indicators do you look for?
Well, the question is the original one that you asked. Like, the only time where strength becomes too much is where you are developing strength at the expenses of velocity, which means that you're either training too heavy and therefore you develop slower motor patterns and therefore you're moving slower, or you are training too much and you're getting way bigger than what you should, so your power to body weight ratio is affected. As long as you can get stronger, jump higher, and run faster, the stronger you are, the better it is. But it's about the quality of your training intervention.
Right.
And let me tell you, I know, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone in this room. I think you guys are extremely smart and you're going to be outsmarting me very, very soon in your career. But the number one mistake that all young practitioners do when they go out and teach and coach is just too much volume. Too much volume. Because volume, whether we like it or not, is going to affect hypertrophy. And these athletes are going to get too big, too fast before they can get strong enough. And all that mass that they now need to move is not backed up by strength. It's going to slow them down. It's going to expose them to higher risk of injury. Volume is the most abused training variable in our industry because we are under the assumption that more is better. With strength training, it's not the case. It is a U-shape. At the beginning, you have to do very little. Then when the athlete develops better technique, better skill, better adaptation, you need to increase the volume to the point that you get to a point where they're so good at what they do and they can be so intense in their training that you need to decrease the volume again. You need to be able to modulate that volume throughout an athlete's career from year to year to make sure you're never doing too much, because that's the one thing that can break an athlete's career. And I say that knowing that I've seen that, I've done that, we've all been there. We learn by doing mistakes. Keep an eye on volume.
With like the new technology, there's a lot of stuff out there that's like mumbo jumbo,
90% of it.
90. What technology do you use to track an athlete's improvement and readiness?
That's a great question. If I were to choose, and I'm sorry to do that, but like when people, and that's a question I've asked, people ask me a lot, because sports science now is all about, it drives me insane. Sports science should be about, we are the software. We are the power behind anything we do in the weight room.
You think we rely on it too much?
We shouldn't be relying on actual technology and hardware and softwares. Those are a nice extra, but it seems like the sports science industry is now is moving toward a direction where like they need to get the most expensive, the latest technology, and they're forgetting about hiring good quality people that actually know their job. We are the software. We are the deal breaker when it comes to like performance. Having technology available is nice. Doesn't have to be expensive. Doesn't have to be complicated. So the Italian part of me coming out in an environment where you have to work with very limited resources, not like here in the States, that when you work for Division 1, you have everything you want. Like my first job in Boston, there was a small Division 3 college. We had 98 football players and 3 squad racks. That's limited resources. That's the type of environment where I thrive and where I want to find myself to like problem solve, because that's how you really learn a lot of stuff. So the one piece of technology that is very impactful that you can use to monitor readiness, so fatigue and performance, is cheap, easy to use, maybe not super sexy, but like pretty easy to carry around and transport with you, is a simple jump mat. If you have a contact mat that gives you a few key metrics like flight time, jump height, maybe reactive strength index if you're very, very lucky, that's all you really need. And without dropping names or brands, but you can have one of those for a couple of $100. If you're very good, that's why I say we are the software. If you're very good at what you do, you can do that with a smartphone for maybe like $9. Doesn't have to be complicated, but you need how to read that number and take decisions based on that number. No app will tell you that. No $1 million software will tell you that. You are the brain. You are the software.
When you say measure fatigue, how do you measure fatigue? Considering its multifactorial nature, it's emotional, muscular, metabolic, physiological.
You listen to a lot of my podcasts, dude. Okay, good. I'm glad you did. You make me feel spoiled. Like, thank you. So fatigue is a multifactorial element, and I'm not the one saying it. That's what literature shows. Yes. It sounds very smart when you say multifactorial. Sounds like you know what you're talking about. What we can measure in a weight room is probably limited to neuromuscular fatigue. That's the primary thing we want, which is it's a combination of like how fatigued your muscles are, how fatigued your brain is, and how much stress your endocrine system is taking on, because they all kind of like coincide in like how much force and power you can generate. So the easiest way to do that is measuring jump height on a counter movement jump. You have your baseline, you know what your athletes are normally capable of jumping. You set a threshold of like what your comfort zone above and below that average, and that gives you your, let's call it like a readiness zone. Like simple terms, you normally jump about 40 centimeters. You set about 10% confidence interval. So if you're jumping 36 or if you're jumping 44, you're within that norm. If you start jumping consistently below 36, that's showing you some fatigue. You're chronically fatigued. You want to be able to bounce back in your norm, eventually supercompensate and go above that 44. So jump height is the most simple thing to measure fatigue, at the same time measure progress. Now you have a bigger budget, you have, I don't know, like a very rich boss that hires you and you can purchase more cool things. Then I would say a jump mat and a VBT device, like a linear position transducer, like one with a cable. Yeah. Doesn't have to be the gold standard, something just to start doing VBT and get familiar with that. If you ask me like an extra one that I would recommend, would be something that can measure heart rate variability, like a wearable device. So you can account for more factors of fatigue, but that would be it. Then if you want to take it next level and then do sports science, then I'll say, well, you probably need force plates and whatever you, but the practical, the whole gym, the whole lab, but the practical applications, like, I hope I don't offend anyone that is in sports science, but going from no technology at all to a jam mat, you're gaining like 3,000% of more accuracy, like a whole lot more accuracy. Going from a jam mat to a force plate, you may be getting at 30% more. The increment is not the impact of that one piece of technology is not that significant. It becomes significant if you're after other metrics, like if you're doing research, if you're in rehab or whatever you. But in terms of what we need for performance, a $200 jam mat is plenty, or a $20 app on your phone is plenty.
All right. We're nearing the end here. We just have a few other supplemental questions for you. But in terms of, I guess, what may play a role in fatigue, you already kind of covered that, but it could be nutrition.
Yep.
How involved, are you in your athletes' nutritional habits and behaviors? And I know we talked about this in class before, or earlier today, you're talking about scope of practice and how you normally refer out.
Yep.
How do you feel about nutrition? How far do you kind of play a role in that in terms of what they're eating?
That's a great question. So I'll give you two answers. So I'm a registered sport nutritionist.
Okay.
So I'm within my scope of practice to adjust nutritional needs for athletes with being cleared by a practitioner. So athletes that don't have any metabolic condition and they're clear to follow a normal nutrition, then I can intervene and do it. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a biologist. But if those are the conditions, I can have full control of what they're eating, like prescribed macronutrients, quality, and all that good stuff. And that's a great thing to have if you want to work with elite level athletes, because nutrition and training, they're like so intertwined. You can't really separate them. The normal conditions where, like, let's say you're a practitioner and you're a strength and conditioning coach, you can't really control what they're eating or recommend. However, there's a loophole, and it's not a real loophole. It's like a training variable that you can control without knowing exactly what they eat. And that is energy availability. It's a very complex metric. Is your energy intake for the day minus your energy expenditure for your physical activity divided by your lean body mass. And that's evidence-based practice. We know that that number needs to be between 35 and 40 kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass. If you're below that, your endocrine system is affected and you're going to go, sooner or later, you're going to be in chronic fatigue. So your performance is going to decrease. So if you look at the numbers that constitute this unit, is your caloric intake. You don't need to prescribe it. You just need to ask your athletes to give them a food journal showing how many calories they're eating. You don't need to ask or change anything. You just need to be able to calculate it. You are designing the training program so you can calculate how much energy they're burning for one session or more than one session. You know their lean body mass. That's something that everyone has access to. You can calculate that number, and through that number, you can adjust your training to make sure that you make up for what you don't know about their nutrition. So you're kind of like reversing engineering the problem. If the athletes are very collaborative and they listen to you, they will take care of the energy intake. They will figure out a way to either eat more, eat better, go to a nutritionist or whatever the case may be. But on your end, by just eyeballing where they're at, it's an estimate. You're never going to be extremely accurate. But I mean, if the number comes out to be 25, you're in troubles. Like, that's way too low. But if you see that kind of like it's within that 35, 40, you kind of know that your training intervention is kind of safe. But then you need to like dig deeper in what they're eating, when they're eating, how they're eating. And again, that can be out of scope of practice. So I'm happy. If you guys want to do another whole episode on energy availability, that's beautiful. I'm happy to do that.
I was curious, how do you continue to see improvements if you're not in a dedicated bulking or cutting phase?
What do you mean?
Like your athletes, do they have to be in a bulk to see improvements in the gym? No.
I don't. Well, so the athletes that work here right now are different, a little bit different than the average because they need to keep a certain size because of aerodynamic reasons, but also because of the weight on the bike. So they can be big and strong. They're weightlifters on wheels. They're muscular, but they can be too muscular to the point they're either too heavy or no longer aerodynamics. So they need to be careful in the way they develop their body shape. With that being said, their variation in weight off season, in season is roughly 3 kilograms. So I don't do any bulking. I don't do any cutting. In theory, you shouldn't need to do that. Your gains in strength and power should be irrelevant of a change in body size. Meaning that for irrelevant, what I mean is like increasing body mass should not be an intentional goal. It should just happen as you get stronger and bigger and faster and more powerful. Then if you're in a situation where, okay, now you have to like really raise the bar and really get to a level of strength that is way above average, then you need to develop muscle mass. That's where throwers get bigger. That's why weightlifters get bigger, because their level of strength, their minimum that we were talking about earlier, their minimum level of strength for their competition is so much higher than the average that they need to bulk up eventually. But that's the only condition where I would recommend anyone to worry about bulking up and cutting down. Otherwise, like, hypertrophy is kind of like a side effect of you training well for strength.
One thing I've seen other strength and conditioning coaches do, and it's a tradition in the MMA fighters and boxers, and also I was watching Rocky a couple nights ago. But they practice abstinence. Is that something you've ever prescribed?
Never even had to worry about. Never. Just enjoy life. Life is too short to compromise your personal life under that point of view, or food or anything. Like, that's a bias, unfortunately, that I have. And I mean it with like not trying to like exaggerate things. I've been a paid athlete. I know what that means to be paid to perform in sport. And I know how much pressure is on you. No money, no competition is worth to missing on life. In any case, in any situation. Career can end in a second. Your life and money can be gone in a second. All you have left is your health and your mental well-being. So anything that is going to hurt that is not a practice I will ever recommend. No matter how high the stake is, if you don't enjoy what you're doing, and if you can't continue enjoying life, it's not worth the game. That's my personal opinion, but everyone is different.
Plain and simple. I like that.
Yeah.
Any supplements you generally recommend?
Whey protein. If you can't consume enough protein with your regular diet, maybe creatine, because it's proved to have effects on performance, and maybe glutamine if you're struggling with your immune system, when like you're under a high volume type of training period. But that's about it. I usually don't. Well, multivitamins and like omega-3, like the basics, right. But no like any particular type of supplement unless it's absolutely needed. And the situations where he's absolutely needed are not many, honestly.
All right. Well, yeah, I think to keep things, we got to build up some anticipation here, especially if we're going to be releasing another episode. So
I have the feeling we are going to release another episode.
I think so too.
There's a lot left.
Right. There's a lot of stuff we kind of had to. We had to leave again. We had to leave for the next episode, but essentially, yeah, we just want to close out with you. We want our viewers to kind of know where they can find more of your work. We want to know, right, if you have any. I don't know if you ever watch Hot Ones. You know how at the end he always gives the interviewer an opportunity to just tell the viewers what you got going on in your life. Do you have any studies, anything exciting coming up?
I have a lot of exciting things with my daughters and my wife. That's the number one priority in my life. Other than that, I have a lot of stuff going on. My work with the national team, some research projects. I have a new book coming up next year. Some online content, work with the NSCA. But everything I do, I'm not good at social media. I'm horrible at social media. So I keep one, and it's Instagram. And everything I do is on Instagram. And I post everything that is coming up. I usually post either myself or through the NSCA or companies or teams that are partnering with. Like now we're flying to Italy. We're doing a course at Ferrari headquarters in Italy. That's awesome. And all NSCA stuff. And I got an opportunity to teach in a premier environment. I love it. So everything I do is usually on Instagram. The only thing is that people go and look for me, and 90% of the pictures I post is either my wife, now my daughter, or my dog.
Unrelated, yeah.
But it is me, and if there's something going on, I'm going to post it there.
Yeah.
And I'm not a jerk, so usually if I do see messages coming in, I reply and have no problem sharing my phone number and email. So I'm always down to jump on a phone call and talk about sports science, strength and conditioning, email, Zoom. If I don't reply, it's because I haven't seen it. And again, I'm very bad at social media.
Well, you heard it here first.
Yeah.
That would be why.
Yeah. So if I don't answer the first time, shoot me a second message. Don't get upset. I'm not ignoring anyone. But social media, Instagram is usually the easiest way to contact me and see what I'm up to. And if you ever want to join anything I do, I'm open book policy every time.
He's a man of the people. We love to hear it.
Do you have any parting wisdom for whether it's new practitioners or young athletes who are getting into strength and conditioning?
Yes. The one thing I tell everyone, don't assume you know stuff. Take every workout, every set, and every rep you program for someone as an opportunity to learn. And you'll never stop learning, and you constantly continue developing. The moment you assume your program is going to result in an outcome, that's when you start failing. Don't ever assume. Always question what you're doing and keep an open mind and be objective. When things are not working, that's a positive thing for you because at least you can see it and you can fix it, you can learn. If you just assume they're going to work and you never measure that objectively, you're never going to learn whether or not what you're doing is worth or not. So always question yourself and take an opportunity. Every time you're in the weight room, every time you're coaching a lift, that's an opportunity for you to learn. Never, ever stop doing that, ever.
Antonio, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for your time. It was a pleasure again. We'll see you soon.
100%.
It's not goodbye.
You see me in class on Wednesday. You better be there.
And we'll link your books in the in the description.
You can find that on his Amazon storefront. He will link it in there.
Thank you. If you have a hard time sleeping at night, they're great books to keep next to your bed. Read through them. 2 pages, you're out.
Is your face on the front?
My wife is on the front cover.
Oh,
that's good. That's the only good thing about the book. Everything else is like, whatever. Later on, we'd be under the table to make sure it's balanced, or like there would be paper for you to take notes on.
Yeah. You know, I just thought about this. Yeah, your kids are gonna have a ball watching these videos when they grow up. Like just again the wisdom you hold.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. And again, it's an honor to be here. I know how much work you guys put into this podcast, and you're good at what you do. So I hope it's not going to be the last one. So keep up with it.
All righty. Well, we'll catch you guys later.
Thank you.